I'm very pleased to introduce Damian McCann, who is a couple psychoanalytic psychotherapist working as head of learning and development at Tavistock Relationships. He's also a consultant systemic psychotherapist working in a child and adolescent mental health service and is an associate of Pink Therapy, where he teaches on the diploma in relationship therapy for gender and sexual diversities. Over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? No. Oh. That's a good start. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, maybe I just need to push this. All right. Is that better now? No. Maybe I don't want you to hear me.
Hold on. Let's make sure it's on now.
I think it's on.
And what number is it?
I don't know. Maybe I'll swallow it. Can you hear me now? Still not. I'll probably need to hold it then like this. Yeah? Is that better? Okay. I do get anxious when I'm presenting, and I do get anxious coming to conferences, but I feel a particular anxiety standing before you today, and I've been trying to sort of work out what it is, and I think it is reflective of what we've been talking about, which is a fear of getting it wrong, a fear of saying the wrong thing, not being good enough, being judged, being attacked. So all those fantasies are inside my brain at the minute and inside my body, and hopefully as I go on they'll lessen. But I think it's part of a collective unconscious that links to the topic where we are examining, really, I guess. I've been charged with with looking at the couple in transition, and I'm going to sort of read the paper. Hopefully I'll look at you from time to time. But I think we need to accept that there's actually a dearth of research and theory relating specifically to intimate partner relationships of trans people. In this paper, I'm going to attempt to provide something of an overview of the particular challenges couples face when one of the partners decides to transition. And then I'll move on to consider some of the clinical issues when working with such couples and the ways in which the theory underpinning couple psychoanalytic theory may be applied to our work with couples in transition. Transgender experience, according to Carroll, refers to the many different ways in which individuals experience their gender identity, as we know, and we've been talking about today, outside the simple male-female binary. Gender dysphoria and gender identity disorder, as we know, are terms used to label and define those with a persistent cross-gender identification or discomfort with one's sex, often accompanied by a desire to make one's body congruent with the preferred sex. But the danger in reducing and applying such labels to trans experience is that it effectively shuts down the space available to navigate between what is considered pathological and that which falls into the area of difference. Indeed, transgender couples are believed to be pioneers in the navigation of intimacy, stability, and excitement outside the heteronormative gender binary. In order to honour and reflect this expanded frame of reference, I think we need to utilise the broader definition of transgender as an umbrella term that includes all gender non-conforming people, although I recognise that some transsexuals may not be comfortable placed under this more inclusive trans umbrella. Nevertheless, my motivation for moving in this direction is to counter the tendency to push towards the centre at the cost of privileging difference, confusion, and uncertainty. It is as if psychotherapists share the same anxiety as some of our patients or clients who themselves struggle to stay within and manage the site of discomfort, confusion, and uncertainty without the tendency to foreclose. I'm reminded of a young trans man who I saw some years ago in the context of his family, whose wish to transition totally dominated the sessions. It was as if he'd all been taken hostage by the force of his made to the extent that it was virtually impossible to raise any kind of question about the speed or direction he was travelling. Paradoxically, it was only when he had everyone on the same page that he could then allow himself to really feel internally the meaning of his decision, which in turn provoked a psychic collapse that subsequently then enabled a more integrated transition. If, therefore, we as therapists are able to tolerate and allow difference into our consulting rooms and difference into our thinking, my hope is that we'll be better placed to serve our gender variant and gender non-conforming individuals and couples who themselves may be struggling to manage difference. Sorry. So I'm now going to move on to thinking about the couple in transition. Thank you. Social and familial challenges related to transitioning can cause great strain in people's lives, and especially in interpersonal relationships. Lev and Sennett, for instance, believe that it is not necessarily the transition itself that is challenging for partners and families, but rather the immense discrimination and social stigma related to being differently gendered. So I just want to look at this film because I think it touches on some of the discomfort and some of the things we've already looked at today. So thank you.
An everyday scene, 4 friends out for lunch. On the surface, nothing remarkable. Nothing to suggest that 2 of these women are at risk. And never more so should they fall in love.
In 1999, I met a soldier named Barry who was able to see me as the woman I am and who loved me for the person that I am. At a certain point, his fellow soldiers discovered that the girlfriend that he talked about so much, the transsexual, they discovered that I was transsexual. This all culminated in his murder on July 4th in 1999. They beat him to death with a baseball bat in his sleep. We bring out a certain fear and a certain anger in some people who interact with us because suddenly they find themselves questioning themselves or about how their response to us affects their identity. Suddenly something that they thought was a bedrock part of their identity has been challenged.
Hey Cal, I'm looking at your board and...
Andrea and Calpurnia run a website serving the transgender community, offering advice on everything from medical and legal issues to fashion and makeup. Their personal histories defy simple classification, male, female, hetero, homo.
People always assume that this is all about sex. And certainly we are all sexual beings in some way or another, but that's not the entire story. People transition for a lot of reasons. One of the confusing things in my own case for some people is that I'm attracted to women, and so they think, why would you do all this if you were attracted to women? And I think it really points out that this isn't about who you want to be with, it's about who you are. People want to have this nice, simple, black and white, binary world where everything's easily compartmentalized. But there's always going to be people who challenge those categories, and that's what we do with gender and sex and sexuality.
An everyday scene, 4 friends out for lunch. On the surface, nothing.
So a further challenge that some couples face is that related to the spectrum of gender mobility and the definition used, i.e. gender fluid, gender queer, or transgender, etc. Partners may struggle to understand and accept the spectrum of gender expression, ranging from those who mix or blend gender, those who oscillate or move back and forth from one gender to another, and those who feel that some form or even substantial body alteration is necessary to align inner experience and identity with outward appearance. In other words, for a number of individuals who identify as trans, sexual reassignment surgery will not necessarily become the end goal in their journey towards transition. Furthermore, taken from the perspective of a couple relationship, the journey stops being about the individual's needs in isolation, but rather about how the couple as a dyad face the transition together. Furthermore, the twinning of gender and sexuality adds yet another layer of complexity for couples and practitioners alike. Currer states that the term sexual orientation remains largely intelligible only if sex and gender remain relatively stable categories. This is because those identifying as transgender appear to disrupt the boundary that enshrines gender and sexual orientation, a kind of transgressive sexuality. Anxieties are therefore raised when individuals and couples present with complex issues and questions concerning one's gender, one's sexuality, and of course the relationship between these two. A question that seems to arise is what happens to an individual's sexual orientation following transition, and how is this then managed within the couple relationship itself. According to Israel, 75% of trans individuals will re-examine and explore their sexual orientation during transition, and of those who do, at least half will redefine their sexual orientation within the first few years of transitioning, defined as the wild card of transitioning. These shifts in sexual orientation will inevitably impact the identity of both partners, as well as raising questions concerning levels of intimacy. So, Bokhtin et al., underscoring this point, suggests that trans-specific concerns include managing gender dysphoria within an intimate or sexual relationship, concerns related to erotic cross-dressing, shifts in sexual orientation or sexual preferences as part of gender exploration or gender transition, as well as the specific impact of hormonal or surgical feminization or masculinization of sexual desire and sexual functioning. For Diane and Jacob, née Susie, Diane says, "Jacob and I discussed what it meant to be a man, and I was trying to control what kind of man Jacob would become. Eventually it became obvious that I was trying to wrest some kind of control in a situation where I was afraid I had none. Especially after Jacob started testosterone treatment, I worried that runaway masculinity would change him so much I'd lose the person I loved." Diane continues to speak about the impact her partner's transition was having on her identity by imagining what might happen if she were at the grocery store and the clerk complimented her on her lovely handbag. She replies, "Thanks, my husband gave it to me, except he used to be a woman. He used to be my wife. He had his sex changed, but I'm still a lesbian." And you kind of wonder what happened to Clark in that sort of exchange, really. So he tries to get his head around that. This innocent enough quote brings into sharp relief the two separate individual identities brought together inside the couple and the relationship of this to a potentially hostile and unaccepting outside world. This can undoubtedly be a developmentally stressful time for the individuals and the couple concerned, and it's worth reminding ourselves that the rate of suicide for trans people is 3 times the national average. Minority stress and trauma, as we know, is corrosive and is responsible for increased rates of anxiety, depression, alcohol and substance misuse, risks with one's sexual health, and of course suicidal ideation. And although we often focus on the trauma for the individual, we know if you look at if we look at what happens in couples where one of the partners is depressed, it's got the same sort of power to disrupt and derail and cause double stress, double trauma for the two individuals concerned. Yet Diane and Jacob were able to transition together, whereas a number of couples are not. It seems that in the past, the dominant belief that couples would not stay together may well consciously or unconsciously continue to exert an influence on couples where one of the partner discloses that they are questioning their gender. A big part of being able to travel the route together seems to depend on whether the non-transitioning partner can manage and work with the impact of their partner's identity change on them. Fox and O'Keefe believe that the partners who are able to remain accepting and flexible are better positioned to cope with and continue their relationship. It has been suggested that those who identify as bisexual may be more able to tolerate and work through the challenges. Conversely, those who react only with shock, denial and anger may have a much harder time making the journey or being able to grieve the loss of the partner with whom they originally fell in love in his or her new gender. Diane says of Susie, "It took a long time. She approached it slowly, like navigating a labyrinth, spiraling closer and closer to the truth at the center. For 15 years, the love of my life had been a girl named Susie. Then she said the words that I had been dreading, and just like that she was gone. I still see her sometimes, brief glimpses of what once was. I used to occasionally tear up. The truth is, a small part of me misses her. A part of me always will." The questions that arise for a non-transitioning partner are in some ways similar to the literature on coming out as gay, lesbian or bisexual within the context of a marriage or long-term relationship. For example, why didn't my partner disclose gender issues sooner? Was he or she lying all those years? Is my husband really gay or my wife really lesbian? As if those are the only two orientations that husbands and wives could possibly kind of think about. Does my partner's trans identity suddenly invalidate the experiences we shared? Is there something I've done wrong? Is it my fault? Can we continue to parent together, or will doing so harm our children? And in that regard, many of you will have read the recent article in The Guardian in early February this year, entitled "Clash of Two Minorities as Ultra-Orthodox Family is Split by Transgender Case Ruling." Essentially, we have a trans woman with 5 children, post-operatively seeking to have contact with her children in the context of a community's threat to ostracize the family if contact is permitted. Mr. Justice Peter Jackson ruled that it was not in the best interest for the children to have contact. It has been suggested that those holding rigid gender boundaries and beliefs may well struggle to manage the transition together. Furthermore, a joint report from the National Centre for Transgender Equality and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force found that trans men were more likely to retain the relationship than trans women. One possible explanation for this is that a strong percentage of trans men were partnered with queer women, who may have found adjusting to a trans partner easier than it would be for a straight woman. The suggestion is that straight women tend to have definite perspectives on masculinity, and because of this may struggle much more than bisexual, lesbian or sexually fluid women. However, when Susie, through transitioning, became Jacob, Diane found herself in an awkward position, since to the outside world she was a supposedly straight woman. Yet Diane identified as lesbian and was in fact active within the lesbian community. And the struggle and anxieties did not stop there, as Jacob asks, "After being in an intimate relationship in which you saw my marked body and you looked upon me as a female, can you really truly see me as the male I now identify? And to what extent does a partner's identity or gender expression determine how the other identifies?" Jacob reminds us that Diane is a lesbian, or bi or queer, because she identifies as such, and she'll remain a lesbian as long as she continues to identify as such, regardless of who she's actually sleeping with and regardless of whether her partner's identity has changed. It's not hard to see from these quotations some of the complexity that couples who transition face as they work through the multiple layers relating to pre- and post-transitioning and taking on aspects of the new gender. At the same time, it is worth reminding ourselves that relationship commitment can serve as an important coping mechanism when dealing with the complex feelings around gender identity. Given the negativity of the outside world towards transgender, transsexuals, and trans generally, it seems important to recognize relationship commitment as an important, resilient factor. I'll end this section of the paper with a final quote from Diane and Jacob, if I may. This one describes the chest surgery, and Jacob says, "The night before my chest surgery, Diane and I had one of our worst fights ever. It was a jumble of fears, blame-throwing, anxiety and terror of the unknown beast I'd unleashed into the once safe and still forest of our relationship. She was afraid I might not wake up from the surgery. She was afraid I might abandon her, and I was afraid Diane would leave me. And Diane says, and as regards the chest, one I didn't recognize, one that wasn't quite done because it needed weeks to recover, I put on a positive face because he was so excited about getting one step closer to a body and a life that finally felt right." And I guess that's sort of pretty close to unconditional love. Cochin et al. Suggests that therapists' awareness of the impact of stigmatization and the need to help the individual or couple tap into sources of support within the family network is essential for optimal development and adjustment of the trans identity. Yet, despite the important role that therapists play in the lives of transgender and transsexuals, there's more than a suggestion that the field continues to practice selective mutism rather than effective practice. In that regard, we might characterize our own profession, as Patricia says, as being in something of a transition, and perhaps this conference is an important step towards that transition. So I'm now going to finish the last section, which is to look at the couple psychoanalytic perspective. Psychoanalytic theories have voiced an almost complete opposition to gender reassignment surgery, historically comparing it to psychosurgery. Yet at the same time, psychoanalytic thinking and practice has provided important developments to our understanding of complex intrapsychic phenomenon that is often rooted in human suffering. Part of the translation from individual to couple therapy lies in the therapist being able to hold what Mary Morgan refers to as a couple state of mind, since the couple therapist will inevitably be searching for some preliminary understanding of the area in which the couple's shared anxieties and unconscious fantasies lie. Within this endeavour, the couple is encouraged to consider underlying behaviours in an effort to help them move from a place of judgment and reaction towards understanding. Utilising the application of this thinking, I'll explore the presentation of a couple struggling to manage the disclosure of a partner's transgender and partner who was going through gender reassignment. Jamie's 23, Eleanor is 26. They met by chance on a retreat. Eleanor was attracted to Jamie's sensitivity and warmth, and Jamie found Eleanor accepting and understanding. During the retreat, they spent a lot of time in each other's company, and both were keen to develop things further. In terms of background history, Eleanor is the eldest of two siblings, and at the age of 14 learned that her father was in fact her stepfather, and her brother was in fact her half-brother. This had a profound effect on her sense of identity and security within the family, and she often found herself wondering about her birth father. Jamie is also one of two siblings, with a sister 2 years older than him. As a child, Jamie, who was called Katie, often found that she cross-dressed and she eschewed most things feminine. Although she persistently told her parents that she was a boy, this was not accepted within her immediate family, and for most of her life, Katie felt an outsider. Because of Katie's struggle to find and assert her true identity, it wasn't until after university that she completely felt able to begin the process of transitioning. At the point that Jamie met Eleanor, he was seriously considering phalloplasty, although he was anxious about the procedure and wasn't at all convinced that it would be the success he hoped. The couple presented for therapy a few weeks into the relationship, following Jamie's disclosure to Eleanor of his trans identity. Eleanor was initially shocked and then furious that Jamie had, as she saw it, betrayed her trust in him. Jamie was remorseful, but was also desperate to hold on to Eleanor, the first real love of his life. However, at that point, the couple presented for therapy. Eleanor was virtually mute, and Jamie was highly anxious and despairing. During the initial assessment, the therapist attempts to understand the nature of the couple's internal representation, or more precisely, the meaning of the unconscious couple fit. This is seen as crucial to gaining an understanding of why the couple is together and why they're now presenting for therapy. For all intents and purposes, Eleanor, who felt a certain sense of betrayal in her own family of origin, is now experiencing the same feelings with Jamie, who, like her mother, had concealed a certain crucial fact of life. Jamie, who longed for acceptance and mirroring of his authentic self, is now once again on the receiving end of a loved one turning away. Dynamically speaking, each of the partners are in touch with themes of betrayal and rejection, and although these appear to represent a split within the couple, in reality they speak to a shared experience of being rejected by loved ones, and both have had the experience of being left feeling exposed. In a situation like this, the therapist attempts to speak to the split in order to help the couple become more aware of the shared nature of their struggle. The aim of this is to help them reflect on the meaning of their connection so that they can begin the process of speaking to the fears and anxieties that are endangering their relationship. Essentially, both partners are fearful of revealing their vulnerabilities to each other, with a history of having to manage these feelings alone. Furthermore, the therapist will also be working on the projective system, since Eleanor is projecting her own feeling of rejection into Jamie, and he's projecting his doubts and fears into Eleanor. Over time, and with the therapist's help, it is possible for couples like Eleanor and Jamie to withdraw the projections and to speak more honestly about anxieties and fears. But it's also possible that the therapist's own struggle to manage his or her transferences to the material in hand is equally important in working with the relationship that develops between the therapist and the couple. And I was sort of thinking that in this talk, that in a way the couple patient is a couple. And that we're talking about a third here, aren't we? The therapist is actually a third coming into the couple. Alessandra Lemma, for instance, reminds us, much as we saw in the film, that the transsexual confronts the analyst with a disturbing otherness. Lemma says, how that otherness is understood, that is, how the analyst looks at the patient through her distinctive theoretical lens, impacts in turn on the patient's experience and what transpires between them. Although Lemma is speaking about her work with an individual, her comments are relevant to our couple in question, since it is possible that the therapist, like Eleanor, struggles to fully accept Jamie's otherness, and Jamie is again left feeling on the outside. On the other hand, it's also possible that the therapist is in touch with strong counter-transferential material regarding the split in which one identity is privileged over another. Can the therapist manage the multitude of feelings and help the couple stay in touch with the struggle to find a true meeting point where perhaps the phallus comes to hold the potential for development rather than the representation of the thing that's apparently missing? For this couple, it wasn't possible for them to find a meeting point, and Eleanor turned against Jamie and subsequently left the therapy. In that way, she triumphed over her own sense of rejection, and Jamie was again out in the cold. However, the outcome of therapy helped Jamie make the decision to reject phalloplasty, whilst raising questions for the therapist as to the outcome, in terms of whether this was a good or a bad outcome. So by way of ending this presentation, I wish to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak at this important conference. It's not only timely, but also right and necessary for the field to be opening its doors and its minds to the loosening of the stranglehold that gender and indeed sexuality has exerted over us for so many years, and which has underpinned theory and practice. In my work with children and young people, so many of them seem to be questioning their gender. So it behoves therapists and practitioners to do their own walking before they can properly accompany these children and young people on their journey. In that regard, it will be interesting to see how the next generation approach gender in what could be a more open and accepting culture. At the same time, I suspect that psychoanalysts will continue to raise uncomfortable but important questions to help these individuals negotiate both the inner and outer experience as a means of establishing an authentic core self, which, as we have seen, also has an impact on interpersonal relationships. Thank you.
Thank you, Damian, and thank you for your openness and your honesty about your own anxieties. I'd like to open the floor for questions. And I know you all have a lot to ask and say, because before we started, you didn't want to stop talking. So.
Hi, I'm just curious if you ever have to deal with or think about events in the trajectory of a couple's life that might trigger one partner's, in a moment which might have something to do with the moment at which a partner decides they want to transition.
So say a little bit more.
So just if it's ever something that comes up in the therapy that a couple has a relationship of a certain kind and then something happens at a certain moment, and when one of the partners who may have been thinking for transition for a long time at some point realizes now actually is the moment that I want to do that, if that ever has some reflection with the life of the couple.
Yeah, I mean, I had one couple in mind who I'd been seeing for a number of years, actually, and they had come because they had problems in their sexual relationship. And it took a long time for the man in the relationship to basically start voicing concerns about potency. That was the first thing. And then concerns about not being man enough. So there was a sort of stage progression to finally admitting that he didn't feel like a man. And so we started to look at what that was about for him, and his wife was kind of sitting there frowning and clearly struggling. But once he started to articulate that there was something about the amount of body hair, for example, that he had. There was something about his sense in which he didn't feel like he was approaching his wife in a supposedly manly way. And I was really, this was a long time ago, I was really struggling to know whether he was talking about a gender identity confusion or something about the social construction of masculinity. And I was really trying to sort of get a sense of this. His wife also spoke about the fact that his approaches towards her didn't feel, manly enough. And so I think it was a co-constructed question about whether we were talking about gender, whether we were talking about something else. But your question does, I think, raise some questions about what helps people in a couple relationship to come out. And I don't have a specific answer to that. I'm not sure if anyone else in the room has other thoughts about it. Is it more about the timing, or are you asking whether there's a particular event that triggers it?
It's not specific. I mean, I think your example is quite interesting. I'm curious if you could answer how you did come up with a possible solution to what was happening in that case?
Well, I didn't actually. If I'm honest, I struggled as they did with it. And eventually, I think just the talking about it loosened something. And then he became much more settled in himself. And his wife, somehow between them, they started to resume a sexual relationship. But it seemed to be the thing that was unspoken between them. Something that was known but wasn't actually spoken. They were in therapy for years. And at the point that we left, they were very, very happy, I think, with where they got to in their relationship.
Any other questions? Or comments?
The man in that relationship didn't have surgery, or?
No. Yeah.
Behind that screen.
I suppose we are getting on to the question of masculinity, because I noticed that in the two couples you cited, that it was all women. And I was wondering whether you had some views on perhaps the reaction of two gay men where one perhaps wishes to transition, or even less imaginable, a heterosexual couple where the wife might decide to transition.
No, I was aware of that as well. As I was researching and writing, it did seem to be, that seems to be the predominant discourse. And of course we do have situations where heterosexual couples, one of the partners does transition, where the wife will transition. Was it the wife or the wife? Yeah. Yeah. What thoughts do you have about it?
I'm wondering whether it's a crisis of masculinity, or whether perhaps masculinity is a more fragile construct, which means that it feels more threatening if there is some change in the partner.
Well, as I said earlier, it does seem. It's interesting, this confusion that goes on inside me as well when we start talking about whether we're talking about male to female, female to male. So at the minute we're talking about male to female. Is that what we're talking about? Or
I'm talking about the reaction of the partner who is not transitioning, and what the male partner to a change in partner's gender might be, and that how threatening or otherwise that might be experienced in terms of their own sense of gender.
Well, I think the film touched on that, didn't it? When she, I can't remember the name, was it Andrea, said that we do something to other people's gender when we start the process of transitioning. And I think that I would imagine that these moments, because the assumptive world starts to collapse and people start to then have to dig deep to start the process of travelling either together or separately. And I think in a Beyond's term of -K, I think some people just simply do not want to look, and will flight, will run away from it because it's so uncomfortable and it's so frightening, not just for them internally, but in relation to them, in relation to the external. And we shouldn't underestimate also the power of the extended family in this process. But I just wanted to, I know we're running out of time, I just wanted to say one other thing, which Joe also touched on today, which is what gets killed off. And I'm using the word killed off because when I was young, I did cross-dress. I was very interested. And something in the process of that was so shocking when it was discovered that it had to be killed off, had to be stopped. And it wasn't until some years later when I was in my own analysis and I was on a gay men's week up in Scotland, and there was a whole culture of being able to explore and play, that I was then able, I finally had permission as an adult to return to the source of this exploration that had been cut short. And it was so interesting, the kind of persona I took on as a woman in terms of what the dressing up did. And through that process, I felt completely liberated and at ease with my gender in a way I think I hadn't up until that point, because I was given permission. I was giving myself permission, and there was no judgment, and there was certainly no prohibition. And by the end of that week, I thought, well, I'm not going to do that again, because I'd kind of worked something through. And I just think maybe everybody needs to have permission to go back to the bits that have been killed off around this area. Okay.
One more question? No?
Well,
Duncan does. Sorry.
Thank you. Damian, I'm just wondering, you say, talking about being killed off, do you think perhaps maybe what had happened was, rather than up in Scotland, may have been that you were maybe expanding what was more alive and sort of integrating, let's use a Jungian metaphor, animus anima, rather than... And I suppose it's interesting just thinking about, how you identify now. I've known you quite well for many years. I didn't know that about you. It's quite interesting.
There's lots you don't know, Duncan.
And there's lots I won't say in public. But it's interesting thinking about sort of, parts of us dying, but them still remaining alive. And I'm thinking of a couple I was working with where there were fantasies about partners wanting to transition because of things that they had become involved with. And you talk about sort of a minus K, but there was actually a higher level of anxiety actually needing to know the idea of a decidability and needing some sort of singularity to sort of fix on. And that was a real problem in a fairly extensive piece of work, which had to finish and leave me not knowing, which was in some ways quite intolerable. But that's not really a question, it's a sort of a series of...
Well, it does link, this will be my final point, it does link, if you look at the mental health statistics for bisexuals, incredibly high, and I think it's because of the stress of not being... You're living between, and it's stressful living between and not knowing. And so this push for a kind of surety and a kind of something that's guaranteed seems to be also at issue here or at play. Otherwise, why would we be getting the statistics we're getting for bisexuals? Because on the face of it, they're much freer. But at some other level, there's a suffering going on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Damian.